like, because there's a couple of things, right? And I don't know what it is, Jason, but lately I've been having a lot of conversations around education, right? And reimagining education and rethinking education. And we even had the Secretary of Education on last week, really talking about reimagining. And I really focused on Black boys not being able to read by the end of third grade. And if they're not proficient going into fourth, they are more likely to be put on the school to prison pipeline.
About young boys and what they're dealing with, I think it's a different conversation, right? Because that's about the fact that young people aren't being taught to read, right? And so young boys aren't learning to read by the fourth grade because they're not being taught, because we've done away with phonics in America. And so, right, so whereas we learn phonics, today's time they're learning whole word reading, which does not work because it's not scientifically based, and therefore they don't understand how to take letters and break them down. Now, if you take that idea and you sort of couple it with what's going on today, I think that there are a lot of connections in terms of like, well, why aren't young men reading, or why aren't we doing this, that, and the third? And it's because they don't always know how. And then the other tier is that they don't always get to see people that look like them making the books. And when they do, then there becomes a connection that takes place where they then are sort of encouraged and charged to first learn to read, which is really what's happening, and then fall in love with stories.
Can you talk about the difference and nuance between phonetics and learning versus whole word readings? I love that.
So phonetics, phonics, the idea around phonics is that every single letter has a sound. Right, it's mathematic, right? This plus this equals this word, right? Ant is a plus n plus t equals ant. Whole word says we're going to give you the word ant, show you the photograph of an ant, and say this equals this, which means if I cover the picture, then you don't know what this word is. Right? And this is the way young people have been taught to read over the past 20 or 30 years.
It's the association.
It's exactly.
And how they do it.
Exactly.
It's really
guessing.
It's guessing, essentially. What's up, everyone? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to another conversation, the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with you all. If you can see my smile, it is simply because this author, and you know how I feel about authors, but Jason was one of the first authors that I had on the Mike Muse Show. And Jason was always aware that I don't like bringing authors onto the Mike Muse Show, right? I think you authors are very interesting, and I'll leave it at that because I have an author here. I don't want to give any critique of his fellow colleagues, but sometimes I don't feel like the authors are sincere in exactly what their point and their mission is, and so I'm very particular, audience, in who I present to you. As some of you may know, my audience has grown tremendously since the first time Jason has been on. I met Jason Reynolds, the #1 best-selling author for all the books that he's done. I was vacationing and summering in Martha's Vineyard, and I'm just rocking away on the patio, and I told a friend of mine, I was like, I don't know, there's this author that's being pitched to me. I don't know if I want to do it. I'm not really into these author things. And I told her who the name was, and she basically scolded me for not knowing who he was and for even having the audacity to think about it. And so I said, okay, I'll have him. And then once I had him, I was like, good God, I get it. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jason Reynolds. What's happening, man?
What's happening, man? It's good to see you.
Congratulations on all your success.
Thanks. Same to you.
Oh, well,
Same to you.
Thank you, brother.
Absolutely.
When people know, it's two things. When you come on the show, I get a large response from audiences, but it only makes sense because you're #1 New York Times bestseller, so I shouldn't be shocked by it. But then I was letting people know you were coming on, and the way people fanned out over you was so special. My assistant texted me, Kendall Shue. She's a former teacher. And she's like, side note, I looked through the schedule this week, and you are talking to an author of a book that I read with my students, fangirling over here.
That's
and
amazing.
so she's in North Carolina. And what I love is that your books reach a wide audience, people, age, race, social constructs, gender, geography, all the way from, she used to teach in a very small school district in North Carolina, all the way to my friend Shonda, who I went to high school with, who says that her children are obsessed with you. And I promised her the next time you come, I'll try and get them up here, but I didn't plan it. So Shonda, the next time Jason writes the next #1 bestseller, you'll come up here, man. How does that feel?
I mean, it's amazing. I think, look, I think it's disingenuous for me to say that, years ago when I started all this, that this would happen. I don't think that's true. I don't think I knew what would happen. But I believe in us. I believe in our truths. I believe in human connectivity. And I think it's the most valuable thing that we have. And I think it works when it's sincere.
Yeah.
And I think what everybody is sort of gravitating toward is a certain level of sincerity that's put into the work.
What is it like? Because there's a couple of things, right? And I don't know what it is, Jason, but lately I've been having a lot of conversations around education, right? And reimagining education and rethinking education. And we even had the Secretary of Education on last week really talking about reimagining. And I really focused on Black boys not being able to read by the end of third grade. And if they're not proficient going into fourth, they are more likely to be put on the school to prison pipeline. And so we're talking about reading and literature and words and the power of words. But I think about like English, right? Like I was never that kid. I know some people are. I was never that kid who was excited to take in classes. Like I did the AP English and the whole nine, but I was just never excited to do it. And so I think there's something about the power of words and like the beauty of words, and really now how words and authors are becoming celebrities unto themselves, which is something I never would have imagined seeing it. I mean, you had your one-offs and your outliers, but there's so many of your colleagues now, you part of that, who are now like huge stars and celebrities. Like, what is your thoughts to that? Like,
I think it's a return to form. It's not a new thing. I think that the writers were always the standard bearers. They were always culture bearers, right? We sort of set the tone for the culture. If you go back to the 60s, go back to the 20s, to the Harlem Renaissance, right? The way that people looked at the writers of those times, they went to the writers to know what should we be thinking about as it pertains to our culture, right? The culture at large, the zeitgeist. The writers were the scribes and the megaphones of everybody, right? And of course, you had musicians and you had music and things of that nature as the soundtrack to the time. But the writers were the people in the forefront at that particular time. It's only until like the 80s and the 90s when we were coming up that it was sort of like the writers were taking a back seat and everyone else was taking a front seat. And I think now it feels more like a return to that, which to me makes the most sense. This is the intellectual bank, right? This is the creative bank. Right? It doesn't mean that everybody else isn't important. We know that music is the most valuable art to me when it comes to human connectivity, but the music has to be written. Someone has to understand language, narrative, right? The value of the codified word, right? We all know that. And what you were saying earlier about young boys and what they're dealing with, I think it's a different conversation, right? Because that's about the fact that young people aren't being taught to read, right? And so young boys aren't learning to read by the fourth grade because they're not being taught, because we've done away with phonics in America. And so, right, so whereas we learn phonics, today's time they're learning whole word reading, which does not work because it's not scientifically based, and therefore they don't understand how to take letters and break them down. Now, if you take that idea and you sort of couple it with what's going on today, I think that there are a lot of connections in terms of like, well, why aren't young men reading, or why aren't we doing this, that, and the third? And it's because they don't always know how. And then the other tier is that they don't always get to see people that look like them making the books. And when they do, then there becomes a connection that takes place where they then are sort of encouraged and charged to first learn to read, which is really what's happening, and then fall in love with stories.
Can you talk about the difference and nuance between phonetics and learning versus whole word readings? I love that.
So phonetics, phonics, the idea around phonics is that every single letter has a sound, right? It's mathematic, right? This plus this equals this word, right? Ant is a plus n plus t equals ant. Whole word says we're going to give you the word ant, show you the photograph of an ant, and say this equals this. Which means if I cover the picture, then you don't know what this word is, right? And this is the way young people have been being taught to read over the past 20 or 30 years.
It's the association.
It's exactly.
And how they do it.
Exactly.
It's really
guessing.
It's guessing, essentially.
Guessing.
But also too, but if you're showing a picture of what an ant looks like, that can mean so many different things culturally. That can mean so many things about what you're used to seeing. Mm-hmm. But then there's also a feeling of disconnect, that you can have, which is part of why and thank you for making sure I'm gonna start using the nuance of it, because I'm like, learn how to read, but you're using the word taught. They're not taught how to read, which is a big
thing.
Distinguishing point with that, because I always say, like, once you get past third, fourth grade, the math changes. And there's something in the book that I wanted to make a correlation with. The math changes from 1 + 1 is 2 to when you get to like fourth, fifth grade, it becomes more about reading comprehension. And so if you haven't been taught to read, and you don't have the reading comprehension to understand you and Jack went down the street with $5 to buy milk for the cat, and then you spend a quarter on whole milk versus almond milk, right? So all these things. So one, I haven't been taught to read, so that's a challenge. I may not be familiar with that structure of culture of like almond milk and oat milk and cats, right? Because I'm used to dogs who drink water, right? And when I do drink milk, it's whole milk, right? And vitamin D. And so I'm trying to almost translate English while speaking English, right?
Exactly.
Not really understanding there's different dialects and different phonetics that goes into it, which causes the problems that we have, which I believe is why a lot of Black and brown boys are X amount of times to be suspended, right? It is not because they are bad. I think it's more the time they are hiding their insecurities of not being able to read, and so they act out.
The codes are mixed up, right? There's a distortion in the connection between what I know to be true and the language that it takes to express that. And because I can't find the language to express that, I become frustrated. And because I become frustrated, then I act out. And because I act out and you don't want to humanize me, you discipline me. And because you discipline me, and I've been disciplined over a certain amount of times, I'm first suspended, eventually expelled, and now I'm left up to my own devices, and the street is always hungry. And I still don't have the vocabulary to express the things I need, the things I fear, the things that anger me. And so now I'm forced to sort of protect myself, but I only know one way to do so. I'm forced to defend myself, but I only know one way to do so because I don't have the lexicon to express the humanity. Right? And this is what happens. The next thing you know, I'm in Julie.
Yeah.
Happens all the time.
And audience, we're not making up hyperbole. We're not making up examples. Audience, I wrote about this. Google it. There's op-eds where I actually show you the data. I point to the data. I point to the studies and the research. This is research-based, in particular about the suspension rates are at a higher rate. Is this why you chose to center your story around suspension? I'm not saying why, but I'm just curious. Was there a connection that you were making with in-classroom and in-school detention?
Yeah.
Because Black and brown boys are always at a higher rates of in-school and out-of-school detention. And for audience, those who may not be familiar with the world of Jason Reynolds, he's here to talk about the book. I got so excited, I forgot to level set. He's here to talk about his new book, Spider-Man Suspended, the new adventure of Miles Morales, who is a Black and brown boy who is in school and has basically a Spider-Man. And so that way suspension is rooted in Morales being suspended, and we'll talk about the other universe there. But
I mean, I think it's partially about what we're talking about, but it's also about, like you were saying, how Black and brown boys are disciplined at higher rates and more intensely, right? For similar infractions. So if we did take, so like there's literacy and the literacy issue and all that entails, and then there's just disciplinary stuff, right? Kids being kids, and the way that Black and brown boys are disciplined are completely different. Right? It's like if I make a mistake, I'm suspended. If you make a mistake, you're told that you don't get to go to recess or whatever it is, right? And I think that we also have lots of data on that as well. And so for Miles, he's being punished for something that he did, but what he did out of necessity, and he wasn't necessarily wrong, right? He staged a protest in a classroom that he felt like was being racist, and that landed him in in-school suspension. And what that looks like for the basis of the story is like, what does it mean to have a child locked up in school? Yeah. What does it mean to sort of put a young person in a cell within what's supposed to be a free space? He knows that everybody else outside of this classroom is moving around. He knows, and he also knows that something is amiss because he's Spider-Man, right? So there's also something awry that he has to figure out how to deal with while being locked in this classroom.
But for me, that goes into a lot of times often because unfortunately our K through 12 public school system is a one size fits all in terms of teaching. Also too, and we can talk about all the reasons, right? Budgetary issues, the teacher to student ratio, and we can do all those things. But with that being said, oftentimes teachers aren't recognizing the difference in individual students, and in particular the ways that Black boys and brown boys are expressive, right? And sometimes it can seem that the way that we communicate could be aggressive, but it's really not. It's really a term of endearment. I always sometimes am mindful of my spaces because I am such a jokester, right? And so I joke about spades raise me, right? And so me taunting and roasting and being satirical with you is actually my way of like loving on you and showing love. And so so sometimes we express love differently, but if you're not, to your point, don't have teachers and educators or systems or whole words that look like you, right? Those who are teaching you don't have any understanding of you.
I mean, isn't that the conundrum, right? We have teachers. I mean, so much of us are fighting to teach literacy to our young people, but there is a different kind of literacy that also has to be taught to teachers, right? Do you know how to read your room? Do you know how to read the students who are sitting in front of you? There's a cultural literacy that has to take place. There's a literacy of childhood that also has to take place. And if you don't know how to read those symbols, read those letters, those words, those sentences, then you too will act out.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that why, Jason, when you write in prose and in verse, right?
Yeah.
Is that why you do that, in order to connect
I try.
with
I
different
think,
audiences?
Yeah.
Or more expansive audience.
I try to figure out ways to write something that will cast the widest net. Something that will, if you are a young person struggling with reading, this is a book that you'll be able to sit with, right, and work through. If you're a young person who loves to read, this is a book that has all the things you love about reading in it, from language to poetic devices to plot and story, right? If you're a person, for this book, if you like images and you need pictures in the book, because I don't think there's anything wrong with a young person wanting and even an older teenager wanting to read a book with pictures in it. This is one of the few cultures where that's a taboo, right? You go in places in Asia, image and word go together always, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with a young person who says, I need to see some things. And so if you need that, that's also in this book. And I do consider all those things whenever I sit down to make anything.
How are you aware of your audience? Because this subject matter of this book, so I loved how we talked about the structure of your book and how you write about expansive audiences. I love so far that we're setting it into suspension because there is data that suggests and shows that how of a higher propensity that Black and brown boys are suspended at higher rates, and that we're really talking about where issues, we're shining a light on the hidden spots of education in K-12, particularly in the public school system. The reason why I ask you, because this book also deals with like censorship and erasure, like erasure of history, erasure of Black and brown history. It's something that we're experiencing today. How did you know your audience would be ready for that?
You know, the way I think about young people is with the utmost amount of respect. I don't, when I show up to schools or when I show up to a library or wherever they are and we have these kinds of conversations about complicated things, I speak to them as if they're human beings, not as if they're quote unquote kids, right? I speak to them as if they are younger human beings, right? The word kid seems to have, to them, they hear it as pejorative, right? And to most of us who say it, we mean it as pejorative. Whereas for me, I see them as young people, younger humans. And because of that, I speak to them directly. And I know that the bits that they cannot handle, they will let me know that. Or they'll ask the necessary questions. It's only adults who tend to sort of carry the weight of their uncertainty everywhere they go. A kid has no problem asking why. I don't get it. Help me understand. You know, and because I'm around them so often, and I've had these conversations with them ad nauseum, I have the utmost respect and the utmost belief that they can manage and handle the complex ideas of the society in which they live. And it's especially if it is given to them in a language that feels palatable for their level. Right? The idea isn't the issue. How the idea is communicated is where things get a little funky. And that's sort of, you know, people ask, well, do you consider yourself a writer? Sure, I'm a writer. I write for a living. But more than that, I'm more of a translator. Right? You're taking the big idea and you translate it into something palatable for a 14-year-old to say, I understand exactly what's being said. Also, I'm living this every day. And so if anything, he's giving me language from my own experience.
I think that if what I'm gathering is something about respecting your audience. Like
Absolutely.
You respect your audience enough to know that they can be curious and they can be inquisitive. And if they're not there yet, you have belief in them enough that they will reach it or feel comfortable enough to explore it with you on this journey.
Yeah.
And what's making me think about that is I had this, it's a random data point, but it's not a scientific data point. It's a lived experience. I had to do this, lack of better words, I had a keynote, a lunch at Disney World with about 100 dreamers, like high school students from across the country. And it was a big ballroom, and we were doing a gamification of topics. And I said, at the end, I want to pull together and do a Socratic method debrief with these students at the conclusion of it. And the executive is like, we don't think they can do that. And I said, I think that they can. I don't know. I'm not an educator, but I think that they can if we do it right. And they said, we don't want to embarrass them, but you calling them out, unbeknownst. I said, let's try it. If we see that the room gets uncomfortable, if they feel uncomfortable, then we'll back out. But I had a way of opening up in the beginning so they felt comfortable. By the time I ended up like launching into it, the room soared.
Of course.
Right? And it ended up becoming the best. The feedback surveys was that data. It was the best moment of the week, right? And I think it's because unbeknownst to me, I was just respecting this gut feeling that I had that I think they can do it, but also too was being mindful. So I took care of them in the beginning to try and let them know that you are safe to make mistakes and to not be right.
I think that I think
that's brilliant how you think about that.
Every day of my life, I consider the differences between conference, counsel, and condescension. I think that young people know when they're being condescended to. I think that young people only want counsel when they ask for it. And other than that, what they're interested in is conference. They just want to have a conversation, right? They want to be able to be engaged in discourse with people who are supposed to love them, right? So that they can lob their questions, so that they can express how they feel. They can express their fears, their angers, their desires and dreams without being judged for them, right? And if they need counsel, being able to say, now I'd like some help, and for us to give that help. But what they never want is condescension. And every time we say they can't handle something, they feel the condescension.
Is that the framework for you to be a good translator? Is the C's that you just mentioned, conference, conflict, and condescension?
I think for me, that's part of it. But more so, I live by a very particular code when it comes to these kids. And it's another three-pronged sort of mantra that I personally have developed over the course of 20 years. And it's just humility, intimacy, and gratitude. So every single moment of my life, as it pertains to anybody in my life, but more so as it pertains to kids, I enter into that space with a level of humility. I think that a lot of us adults, we forget sometimes that it's okay for us to not know and to tell them that we don't know. And also, there are things that they know that we don't know. Everybody has had a kid. Everybody's asked a kid to help them with their cell phone. If you of a certain age, it's like, you take the selfie. I don't know. Right? Yeah. Like it's okay. I think humility is important, right? Because it allows them a space of power. Right, the scales of power begin to tip and even out. Right, pedagogy gets broken down and rearranged, and it's like, wait a minute, I got something. I have power too that I can give you. I can teach you. Right, intimacy is important. I think that we expect an awful lot of young people without giving much when it comes to our interior lives. Right, so like we give of our resources, we give of our time, but if a young person asks you to tell them a story about who you were at 14, we get scared. Tell me about the mistakes you made at 16 years old. We get scared, right? Then it becomes about boundaries. But the truth of the matter is that you can't ask this kid to tell you what's the matter and to expose their personal lives to you under the guise of you helping them when they know nothing about you. Why would they trust you with their innermost secrets? Intimacy has to be built first, but that can only come through humility, right? And then my last prong is gratitude. I love these babies. This is not make believe. This is not pretend. This is not a mask. Everyone who knows me knows what time it is when it comes to my feelings about the young people of our world, right? And because I love them, and because they have given me purpose in life, and all of us purpose. Even if you're like I'm not a kid person, don't matter. They affect your life every day and make it better, whether you know it or not. We owe it to them to at least be grateful for their existence, and they know it when we're not. So I say thank you as often as possible. These books, I always say, these are my thank you notes. And that's how I truly feel. So humility, intimacy, and gratitude is how I think that is my secret sauce when it comes to connection to these children.
For me, audience, I hope, as you're listening to this, I think my takeaways, I love each three prongs from humility, intimacy, and gratitude, conference, counsel, conference, and don't tell me condescension. I think for me, I would like to I think what I do a good job of is putting in relationship and conversation with intimacy and conference, right? And I think for me, I I never liked the idea of sending a kid away because it's a grown folks business or grown folks conversation. And I've always loved enjoying sharing, as you said, the interior of me, because I think that's important for them to learn and to see, so that they do feel trusted. Again, because respecting, I think it's a key word. I think sometimes we want young adults and children to respect us, but we don't respect them.
And we don't want to earn it.
We don't want to, and we can see. I think children, and let me ask you, since you're, do you think young adults and children can sense and feel when you don't respect them?
Of course. You ask
their agency.
Listen, go in any school in America and watch how kids act around certain teachers and how they act around others. You remember school? We all knew the teachers that loved us, and we all did everything we could to stay around them, to try to skip, to get to their classrooms, to try to, right? And the question is, well, what is that teacher doing that the other teachers aren't doing, right? And usually it has to do with the ability to listen, the ability to discipline in a way that feels loving. This idea that kids are afraid of discipline is nonsense. Kids need it. They want it desperately. They just want to feel like the discipline is coming from a place of love, right? And also, I think, listen, the worst thing you could ever tell a kid is, I got my education already, so you got to get yours, right? It's the most dismissive thing in the world. And I think, we call them entitled, right? This is adults. We love this. Our favorite buzzword to throw around for generations up under us, especially Gen Z and Gen Alpha, is that they're entitled. But I don't know of any generation more entitled than the generations of adults, because we believe that we are entitled to their respect simply because we have years on them.
Jason, I can talk to you all day, and I'm going to be mindful of your time. This is a wonderful conversation, by the way. What is it about, I'm just curious, what is it about like Miles Morales that you're excited to write the language for him? What is it about him and his Constitution?
That his superpowers, when you really think about them, are actually just his internal constitution. So, for instance, it's like their spidey sense, right? But if you grew up where Miles grew up, where many of us grow up, spidey sense is just a part of your survival skills. Your mama gave you that, right? You didn't have to get bitten by a spider to know when the bad thing is coming, right? If you live in New York City, or if you live in any major city, you know when the bad thing is coming far before it gets to you, and you know that it's time to bust a move, right? But that's a superpower that in the comic book world is sort of this incredible thing. But in black and brown world, it's life, it's survival, right? I think about his integrity, who Miles is as a boy, his integrity and his grace, the grace in which he moves through this private school, coming from the community in which he comes from. That's a superpower, right? Invisibility, his ability to camouflage. I think we all know what that is for us, right? Some of us may call it code switching. But the truth of the matter is that like Miles knows what it is to put on a mask and disappear. And he knows what it is to take off a mask and disappear. He's fully aware of what that is for survival reasons and as a form of erasure being pressed upon him, right? And so I think what Miles represents for me is that what he really shows all the black and brown kids is that they're already superheroes.
I love it. They already have it in them. The mask that they have that we often have to put on and take off is really our capes.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
In other words, I couldn't think of a better way to end the conversation right there. I see why you are so gifted with the pen, the respect that you have for children, and your own constitution is so strong and rooted in empathy, right?
Absolutely.
And caring and wanting to be the best you can of yourself for the others. That's service. Absolutely. Yeah, so basically you're in service. Jason Reynolds, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please make sure you go out and get this book wherever books are sold and where you can download it. Make sure I get the official title, Miles Morales Suspended, a Spider-Man novel. Cheers to you, man.
Thank you.
Congratulations. I can't wait to have you back for the next one.
Always good to see you.
Awesome. Till next time, folks. Peace.